Okay, so we left off talking about focal length, and that is just one of three things that a photographer can adjust when taking a photo, especially with a manual camera. Obviously, if you're using a digital iPhone camera, a lot of the manual settings are not really typically available to you. The computer in the camera in your phone typically will do these adjustments for you, but if you're using an old school camera, a CLR camera, with manual adjustments, these are the three things that you would adjust. So focal length, aperture, shutter speed. So like I said, we've already talked about focal length. It's basically the distance between the lens and the sensor, adjusting that by twisting it typically. But the next one is f-stop or aperture, and it's the ratio of focal length to the size of the opening that the light is being emitted into the inside chamber. So the aperture would be here, basically, and this opening looks fairly wide, but you could actually bring this in narrower with some manual controls on the camera. And it's called f-stop, which is the ratio of the focal length to the size of the opening. A narrow aperture that lets in little light is a high f-stop. So typically on the camera this would look like f22, and this would be used in really bright light. It's actually used to help control the amount of light that's actually coming in through the lens and into the chamber and onto the sensor or film if you're using a film camera. So the narrow aperture lets in little light and is used in bright light, and a wider aperture is used for lower light conditions and is a lower f-stop, perhaps as low as f1.8. The f-stop determines the depth of field in the photo that you take, or the depth of the area in the image that is actually in sharp focus. So low f-stops that let in a lot of light have a shallower depth of field or depth of focused material, and then higher f-stops that let in little light bring everything near and far in your image into focus. So it's kind of hard to remember which one goes with which, but basically the higher ones have more focus and have less light coming into the camera's actual chamber here. So we'll talk about that third adjustment that is possible by the photographer when taking a photo, and that's shutter speed. And that's actually the length of the time that the shutter is open. So the shutter is on the outside of the camera and it closes off the lens. And so however long that thing is, actually it might actually be inside of the camera. Let's see where it's at. Oh, it's right here. So it's actually however long that is open for, it is actually letting the light in and then it'll close off. So it's actually like a physical thing that comes down and lifts up. So typical shutter speeds range from 1/1000th of a second in really bright light. So if you have a lot of light really blasting your camera lens, coming through your camera lens, you're going to use a really small amount of time to have that shutter open. So 1/1000th of a second, or in low light it might be 1/60th of a second. So for handheld cameras, shutter speeds longer than 1/60th of a second run the risk of introducing hand movement, which can actually blur your photo. So if you are taking a picture at night, so if you've seen pictures of the night sky, the photographer actually had to put the camera on a tripod and angle it up at the sky so that it's not moving at all while that shutter is open, to accept as much light as possible to get that dark night sky image on the sensor or on the film, depending on what it's being taken with, either a digital camera or a traditional film camera. So definitely shutter speed, if you have a really long shutter speed, you're going to have to use a tripod. Otherwise you're going to get some blur in your photo because your hand will move a lot during, you know, a 2-second period. And so that'll make the image blurry. So that's why tripods are used. Most of today's popular cameras, such as those that are on smartphones, will automatically set the aperture, the shutter speed, and the focal length is maybe something you might be able to adjust by zooming with the little 2 fingers or whatever. Artists and specialists generally readjust all of these settings for each new photos, and these adjustments really are the most important thing about this, is that they actually allow all sorts of artistic judgment and all sorts of different kinds of choices for a photographer to make. And so it really makes personal expression possible just by the use of those three adjustments, basically. So we'll take a look at some early art photography by Julia Margaret Cameron. So for many years after photography's invention, the public was really reluctant to accept it as an actual art form because it's done through a mechanical device. And many early photographers were content merely to record just visual information. But today, people really do agree that the camera can be a means for personal expression. So from the beginning, portrait painting influenced photography. And that's because photography was used for portraits to start off with. And one of the very first portrait photographers to be regarded as an artist is Julia Margaret Cameron. And by 1864, she became an avid photographer, and she created a lot of really expressive portraits. And she really pioneered the use of close-ups and controlled lighting, so she controlled the lighting on her subjects to enhance her subjects. And a lot of her subjects were actually family members or famous friends that she had. So we'll take a look at a piece that she did of children called Paul and Virginia. It's from 1864. It's an alumen print, 10 inches by 7 7/8 inches. So with this photograph, she made sure that the exposure was set just right to allow light perfectly to define the roundness of the children's bodies. She posed them slightly off center, which creates a kind of a dynamic balance with this umbrella, with this diagonal line here from the stem of the umbrella. So posing them off center kind of creates a little bit more of a dynamic balance there. Okay, and then I had to pause the video, but we'll resume here. And she actually titled this work after a popular novel about a pair of shipwrecked children. So she's really playing around with novelty when it comes to how she actually posed the children, how she dressed the children, and also the title of the work, which is a reference to a novel written about a pair of shipwrecked children. So she's kind of referencing that in this photo here. So an early influence in the art photography movement was also this guy named he's an American, his name is Alfred Stieglitz. And he actually opened a photography gallery in New York City in 1905. And he also founded the magazine Camera Work, which published a lot of photography along with essays about modern art and culture. Stieglitz's own photography often showed influence of paintings, and his 1901 photograph, Spring Flowers, New York, is an exercise in tonal control because it handles subtle gradations of texture and shade. So we'll take a look at Spring Flowers here in the next slide by Alfred Stieglitz. So it's from 1901. That's very early. It's not very big at all. It's 3 3/4 inches tall by 1.5 inches wide. And this is a photograph. It is not, I don't believe this was done with any kind of a special technique. I think this is just a straight up photograph. So as you can see, the wet street looks different from the sidewalk, and the misty sky has kind of this looming quality to it. You can see how wet that looks. You can see the tree reflection in that wet sidewalk. The background is out of focus, which is intentional. He adjusted the camera settings to get a shallow depth of field, which means he had probably a low aperture with a wider hole, letting in more light, which creates a shallow depth of field. Stieglitz created and exhibited photos to show that photographers could be just as skilled as painters in capturing and interpreting the world around him. So his photographs typically reveal the subtle poetry of what can be found in everyday scenes. And he lived in New York, so they were often urban scenes. So he's definitely an early pioneer of photography, Alfred Stieglitz. He's an American. So we also have another person that we're going to talk about when it comes to early art photography. It's Henri Cartier-Bresson. And we have kind of this piece we'll take a look at. It's taken place in Paris. It's from 1932. It's a photograph. So French photographer or photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson captured a subtle moment of movement and drama in Place de Europe behind Saint Lazare in Paris. Gare Saint Lazare, sorry. It's kind of a tough long title here for me, but so he actually released the shutter at exactly the right moment and at the perfect shutter speed. So a quick shutter speed. So there's not a ton of blur, there's some, to capture a man leaping over a puddle on a cloudy day. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing some flooding. This guy's, probably was on this ladder and now he's trying to leap through as far as he can so he's not getting wet. So the man's shape is echoed in his own reflection in the water here. And there's actually another posed dancer right here in this, on this poster, on this building, or on this fence here. So that's actually kind of a cool juxtaposition of these three figures kind of in silhouette. And even this one here. And these almost look like figures, but I'm not sure if they are. So there's a couple of semicircle ripples in the water here. Maybe pieces of metal, not quite sure. And there are kind of these round shapes that are echoed also in the ripples in the water. So we have some repetition in some of the line here. So for CartierBresson, good photography is all about capturing that really decisive moment. So he's quoted as saying, to me, photography is the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event, as well as of precise organization of forms that give the event its proper expression. So he really did capture that in this piece. He captured the exact right moment that only happens for one small second in our life. He was able to capture this moment, and actually there's a lot of interesting repetition in it, and it's just a cool piece, really. Let me take a look and see how much time we have. We have some more time. So we'll talk about Manuel Alvarez Bravo, Two Pairs of Legs from 1928 through 1929. And this is actually a gelatin silver print. And it combines a billboard and a building site. And it kind of has a lot of interesting shadows present in it. So this is called Two Pairs of Legs. It's 6 by 9, 6.5 by 9.5. And it's basically a building site. And in this photo, these two legs ascend in pairs. So a woman and a man's legs here. And the legs seem to disappear into the building above. And above that is a pair of lamps. And further up, a pair of doubled windows from an office building under construction. So we kind of have a lot of pairs of things, I guess you could say. A pair of legs, two pairs of legs, and then two lamps and two windows here. So there's the woman's skirt here, and you can see that there's a shadow created by the awning, which actually kind of creates another second skirt. So there are definitely some subtle parallels present in this work that make it kind of interesting to look at. And that's probably why he took this photo, because he just thought that was an interesting juxtaposition. And they're missing their bodies, but it's almost like part of the body are these lamps and even the windows. So next up, we'll talk about Man Ray. He came up with his own techniques, basically. The piece we're going to look at is a rayograph from 1929 or 27. It's a gelatin silver print, about 11 7/16 by 9 1/8. So other photographers, such as Man Ray, went beyond the camera itself to achieve more inventive effects. So Man Ray made some innovative photographs, which he called rayographs, by placing objects on light-sensitive paper and exposing them to sunlight. So the rayographs are photographs in which no cameras or lenses are used. They are also visual inventions recorded on film. In this work, it is not even clear what the original subject was. So he just had photosensitive gelatin silver on top of a probably on a silver plate and expose that to the sunlight with